Welcome everybody to session 5. And today, as I mentioned, we'll be going deeper into project control, but we do also have to look a bit at the planning, right? Because last week we looked at planning where we would have developed our Gantt charts, but we didn't go through that in detail. So what we have up in the presentation, hold on, do we have messages? Okay, no, that's just the transcript. All right, somebody else just came in. Okay, so when we look at our course outline, we would have seen for week session 5, we were supposed to go through implementing and managing. I am going to mix implementing and managing along with project control because we already started working on managing, right? So I'm mixing the two together. So we're kind of going to start from the bottom, where we look at the benefits of project control, we're not going to go into the control cycle now, but we'll look at the scope of control, and then we'll go back to the top where we look at methods used, right? So what exactly is project control? And can somebody confirm to me that they're seeing the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, Miss. Yes.
Okay, great. So that is just telling you that yes, we're working on project control. And project control really is that step where we already have a plan and we are looking at our plan every day to manage it across what's actually happening. So we use terms like estimate versus actual because before we would have started working, we would have already known the resources that we have available. So based on that, we would have scheduled how we use our resources. And so now what we need to do is ensure that we use our resources in the manner that we meant to use the resource. And if we have to use it in a different manner, that we at least also take the time to make changes or understand the change that, or yeah, understand the effect that it will have on our overall project, right? Because if you have $300 to run your project and you use all of it in activity 1 instead of using half in activity 1 and activity 2, it means that you don't have a budget to actually execute activity 2 anymore, right? So because of that, we have to ensure that we look at both our estimate, our budget, as well as our actual. We need to make sure that we continue making our notes as we go along, and that we continue to change our plan as necessary, right? So what is control all about? Control is mainly a 3-step process. It takes 1, measuring, so determining what you have through either formal or informal ways. And then we start evaluating to determine the cause and how the cause of things happening around us, or the cause of changes rather, and then so that we can act based on any significant changes we have to make, right? So if you have to make a change, we're able to make it. If it's something that you don't necessarily have to make a change for, you just kind of have to manage the effect of it, like give it a soft landing, then you can do that, right? And the last part is correcting. Now, correcting usually happens if there's a very unfavorable trend happening. So you expected it to go this way, like upward, and you're trending downward or way too low for your comfort, right? It seems like it's going to affect the overall project. Or yeah, it just seems like it's going to affect the overall project. So you make a change in advance to soften the landing of whatever is coming, right? So, well, not really soften the landing, but change it, right? We're trying to move that projection, see what we can change today, to give ourselves better estimates tomorrow. So those are really the 3 steps that we find happening in the control phase. Now, we would have already gone through what we do in the planning phase, so I'm not going to go through that again, but it's important to understand that planning and controlling, they really happen simultaneously. Well, not simultaneously, but planning and controlling, they overlap, right? Towards the end of planning, we already start controlling. So there's an overlap there, and we have to consistently control, right? So based on that, when we're looking at the benefits of project control, what we're really trying to understand is why should we do this? Because it does take a lot of time to make sure that every single day you check your estimates, and you make sure that you're in the right places. It's very stressful. And then sometimes it's not moving in the right direction and you have to spend so much time on controlling. So like, why would we even do it? Can anybody suggest can two people rather suggest two reasons why, well, one reason each, why they think project control from your own understanding is necessary?
I think it's necessary because it helps you to keep track of the project and um, for you to see if you're going in line with the objectives to know what to do next.
Mm-hmm. Good. Good. Any other anyone else?
Miss, that would also give you let's say an idea of if you have to input something or improvise somewhere in case some changes might happen. It's
Okay.
kind of risk management.
Mm-hmm. Right? So both of those answers are very correct. Right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that our train doesn't go too far off the tracks. Yes, there may be some swaying. Yes, you know, things never go as you plan. You will always have things happening that kind of put you back, but you have to ensure that even if it puts you back, you find a way to get yourself back forward or get yourself stabilized, right? You don't wait until things absolutely blow up to start addressing the problem. The other reason is that at different points in times, we have to update our shareholders, or not not necessarily shareholders, but stakeholders, sorry. Right? We have to ensure that everybody that needs to be aware on is aware. Why? Because we need to make sure that when they ask questions, they aren't shocked by the answers that we give, right? We need to go to our investors with information to ensure that we are still working in their benefit, right? So outside of this, another big thing that we have to do in project control is we have to know when we have to start pivoting. There will be times where you have to make changes, whether they're small changes or larger changes, but there will be times where you need to make changes from changes in your scope. It could be the customer is asking for something new. Let's think about a website. Um, think about if you were to make a personal website for yourself, right? Um, you might say, okay, I'm tired of having 5 different social media pages. I'm going to create one website and I'm just going to blog and let my family members know what's happening. But then as you thought about it, you think, okay, maybe I can also, sell some of my consulting services on that website. So you think maybe I should add another tab for that. But if you aren't making the website, it means that you're adding more scope to somebody else's project that you would have contracted to do that project. So yes, it might be easy for them to create just one new page, but you don't know how much time it's going to take, how much resources it's going to take, and if you can afford to take that step or not. Right. So just like you as a customer can understand that there will be changes that you might want to make to a project that you own, we have to also understand that customers will come to us with changes and we need to treat them with grace. We don't say, no, I ain't got money for that. I ain't got no time for that. No, it's not gonna happen. We don't treat our customers that way. We have negotiations, we have meetings, and we find a way for everybody to be as happy as we can make everyone. Right? So it's not just to make sure that we're doing the right thing, it's to make sure that the right people are involved in the sauce at all times. Why? Because we want it to come out in the best way possible. And we want that at the end of this project, when we give them the product, they say, yes, this was what I wanted. But at the same time, you can't allow your scope to creep too high. Why? Because as scope creeps, your resources get used more often or at a higher degree. So because of that, you need to be able to manage your client's expectations as well as your team's expectations. right? So those are the things that we're thinking about when we're going into project control. We want to know who, what, when, how. The same things we wanted to know before, we want to know them now. But we're really focusing right now on getting things done the right way the first time. So that's what project control really encapsulates, right? Just getting things done and making sure that things go right now, because we're currently doing it. So we want to make sure we do it right the first time. So the next thing we need to look at in project controls, now we're gonna skip back a little bit to project planning. So in project planning, we learned about Gantt charts, right? And you guys would have created an example of a Gantt chart. Now your Gantt chart would have included some important details. Some of you that created a work breakdown structure in a flowchart format, I told you to then put your responsibility matrix on your Gantt chart. So that Gantt chart would say what activities you have. It would say who is responsible for each activity. And it would also have the date, time, and everything that they need to get it done. So you have the duration as to how long you will take on a specific task or activity. It will have what specific dates you start and stop that activity at. And it sometimes, most times rather, includes Slack or Float if you have any extra space there to work with. Right? So those are the things that your Gantt chart will tell you. So what happens, how you practically use it is that your Gantt chart will say, so I'm not gonna open a Gantt chart because we saw one before. But let me know if you do want me to, like, raise your hand if you do want me to show this on an actual Gantt chart. But what you're gonna do is I'm gonna open my Gantt chart and I'm gonna check today's June 24th, sorry. I'm gonna open my Gantt chart. I'm going to scroll to June 24th and I'm going to see what I should be doing today. It can be one task. It can also be 3 or 4 different tasks running simultaneously. But what I'm doing there is I'm looking to see, okay, on June 24th, I should have been here on these tasks. Am I there? If I'm there, perfect. It means I'm completely on schedule. If I'm not there, where am I? Am I backward? Do I have to look backward to find my current place? Right? So does that mean that I have to make changes to the dates going forward? Or have I managed to actually do more than was necessary and to be further on my Gantt chart? So now I'm able to look at my Gantt chart and see that my team will probably finish a bit earlier so that I can maybe, well, I wouldn't suggest you ever move an estimate backward. Like, you really shouldn't move your end date backward. But you can discuss that within your team that, hey, it seems like we have like maybe we're running early, so we might finish a 1 or 2 day early. So if you guys continue to do it, we can have a little session in the last 2 days, or we can take the last 2 days very slow, right? But you can generally look at your Gantt chart and know, okay, am I on track or am I not on track? And if I'm not on track, what can I do to get myself on track? Or do I have to do anything at all? Right? So that is the first thing your Gantt chart will show you. The next thing you can look at is a tabular report. And tabular reports, all they really are would be something like a work breakdown structure, right? So it has, instead of the flow chart that some of you did, it would have everything listed on a chart, like one column. And they would also tell you where you need to go. So basically the Gantt chart, but on a table form. And the report would most likely have more language around what is happening. So if we're not here, why are we not here? It would have more information written on if there was a breakdown. So maybe your company makes boxes and there was a breakdown this morning at 5 o'clock, which means that from like 5 to 7, the machines were down and you weren't able to actually make boxes. So today we're gonna probably be behind schedule. So while your Gantt chart isn't gonna state that, oh, we are a little late on this project because of this, right? The Gantt chart really just has the dates. A tabular chart might give you more information, but really and truly, it should be serving a very similar purpose to the Gantt chart, right? That's usually what it shows you, but it shows each activity one by one. Um, really highlighting the duration of those activities. So what it's doing is it's more resource management, trying to make sure that we have enough days for everything that we need to do, and that we're not running ourselves down based on whatever resources we do have. Right, so you guys can take a look at different tabular charts. They look very different. Tabular reports, sorry, they look very different based on what the project is. But yeah, that's something that's very, very, very subjective to what project it's on. Whereas a Gantt chart is more of a stable document. It generally looks the same way based on each project. It just has different columns based on whichever project we're working on, but it lays out pretty much the same. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is activity float, right? Activity float is really, really important in understanding where if we're going to be late or early on a project. So when we spoke last week, I would have told you that first of all, we usually, once we create our Gantt chart, once we have an activity diagram, network diagram, we usually highlight our critical path. Now, the reason we highlight our critical path, and the way we do it, is by doing a backward pass and then a forward pass. So what that means is that we understand that along our critical path, there is no extra time. If anything is delayed on the critical path, it delays your entire project. But the other activities do have slack, and the slack is usually how late you can start a project and still finish how late you can start an activity and still finish that project on time, right? Or how late you can finish an activity and still complete the project on time. So if you use more slack on one activity than is allowed, it means that you either have to hope that there's more slack coming forward, that you can maybe finish another activity along the line earlier, or you can actually delay the project even though there is slack. So if there is slack and you use more flow than is provided, okay, for instance, if you've got 5 days of slack on one activity and you finish that activity in 6 days, if you've got 4 slack on the very next activity and you manage to finish that in 3 days, it means that you evened everything out and you're still going to finish that project on time. But if you use 6 days instead of 5 on the first activity, and then you use all 4 days on the next activity, it means you're a full day behind, right? So while Slack does give you the space to make some changes here and there and fix things up that, that might have gone wrong the first time, you still have to make sure you manage it, because if you don't, you can still delay that project. So that's pretty much how Slack works. Now, when we talk about forward pass and backward pass, what exactly is that? So what your backward pass does is, once you have created your activity diagram, so if you plot your diagram from activity 1 straight to activity 9, you know where your critical path is. So your critical path has 0 slack and the others have some slack. You're going to work from the last activity and subtract forward to do your backward pass to understand just how much slack you have on the entire project, because we have different types of slack, and I'm going to go into that in more detail in the second half of the class where we're doing the PERT chart. But you've got total float, which is how much float you have, or when I say float, slack, these are interchangeable, right? So you have the total float, which is how much float you have on the entire project as a whole. But then you also have float on each individual activity. So your backward pass is trying to find out how much float you have on the entire diagram, and then you're going to do the forward pass to just tie everything up to know how much you have across each activity. We'll do that in the second half of class. I don't want to go more into that, so we're just gonna skip past that into the next thing, which is a logic bar chart. Now, your logic bar chart is It's just another diagram to show you where you are on the project, right? So with a logic bar, okay, you guys really can Google it. I should have put some pictures on here, but it would have been too much pictures on this one slide. But your logic bar chart, what it does is it shows you it creates a bar chart of whatever resources or time you're trying to manage, and it operates very similar to how your other bar charts would operate. Like, okay, let me go to your textbook and see if they have a picture in here. So when we go to GERT, where we're looking at graphical evaluations, let me see if they have one, or if I should maybe Google and find one for you. Somebody's trying to come in. Okay, I don't see it in the GERT. Let me search for the word. Okay. They don't seem to have any logic bar charts in your textbook either. Strange. Let me separate the word bar chart and see if anything comes up, because if it doesn't come up, I'll probably get one up. Okay, so I do see some bar charts when I separate the words. So if you're going to search for it in your textbook, make sure you put some space between the words bar and chart. I don't see anything coming up for a logic bar chart. Let me check for tabular reports and see if they have any of those. I don't see anything coming up for that either. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get 2 pictures of that when we come back. Let me just make a note of it so that I can actually show you what it looks like, but we're not going to spend too much time on that either. Like, I'm not testing you on it. I just want to make sure you understand that it isn't just a Gantt chart that you can use to create these graphical representations and to manage your schedule. I just want to make sure that you see that there are different ways for you to do that, because I did understand that when we spoke this week, a lot of you wanted to know what I expected your Gantt charts to look like. Although I kept telling you that your Gantt charts really will be a reflection of your Gantt chart, and your work breakdown structure will really be a reflection of your actual project and not just my expectations. Like, my Gantt charts generally look different from project to project. Some have very short flows and some have very long flows. Some don't have things overlapping, some do. Some have multiple things overlapping all the time, whereas, you know, others are pretty straightforward. You finish one activity and you start the next. Good. So I will make sure that I get just a graphical representation of a logic bar chart. But all of these really are just different charts that you can use to yeah, these are all different charts you can use to manage your scheduling. So all of them, what they're doing is they're saying our resources are being used in these specific places at these specific times. And it also states that when we look at them, we should be able to see where our resources are at, or where our attention should be placed at each point in time. Right? So these charts, just like our regular bar charts, some of them can be stacked, some of them will be clumped together, some of them you'll have it as a bar chart versus what is the other one when it's like on the side. A bar chart is the ones that has the status symbols going upward. Whereas there's another chart where they're all on the side going across. I don't remember the name of it, but like, what is it? A bar chart, and don't remember. Yeah, but your charts can be laid out based on however you think your information needs to be presented. But what you're using all of them for is looking to see where you should be today versus where you actually are today. So you're going to have one line for where you should be, and then you're going to have a second line for where you actually are. On the Gantt chart, most people don't actually do that unless you create two separate Gantt charts. We don't usually put a budget and an estimate on the same chart because a lot of times your Gantt charts are really, really full and it will look very confusing. I mean, you could put them with different colors, but again, if your Gantt chart is really full, that will be confusing. You can put a separate chart. But with your bar charts and your tabular reports and so forth, it's a little bit easier to have one bar showing you where you should be in May and another bar right next to it showing you where you actually are in May with a different color or some different representation so that you can take a glance at it and see, okay, you're at the right place or you're at the wrong place. And usually, most projects, especially if you're utilizing like a lot of physical raw resources, and you have manufacturing, for instance, set up directly in here, that these things will automatically update by itself. So for instance, if you are late on completing 500 orders of water, your system should be able to say, okay, we delivered only 400 or we actually made only 400. So it should automatically create those markers for you. Right, but I'll show you a graphical representation of it, which might be a little easier for you to digest if anyone has any questions on that. But yeah, all these charts are essentially just there for you to have different ways of representing where you are versus where you should be so that you can make adjustments to get yourself back on track. Now, when it comes to a line of balances, a lot of times you find them directly on another chart. So usually when we create a bar chart or you create some sort of schedule like a Gantt chart, you'll have everything laid out. What the line of balance actually does is it draws a line from one point to the next point to the next point so that you can see if that line goes up, if it's going across, or if it's going downward, just to have a basic representation of how you're moving from one milestone to the next, right? The line, it will be on the graph. So you already have a logic bar chart, and now you're just using a line of balance to draw to see if, well, you're putting a line of balance on top of another chart then. You're using it to gauge with a line where you are versus where you should be. You don't want to look at two numbers and guess. You want to see if the line slants upward or if it slants down to know if you did better this month than last month. Right? So line of balance is really just a line chart on top of a bar chart. Yeah. So before I move off of scheduling, do we have any major questions on Gantt charts or any of these other tools before we come off of this topic? No, no questions. You all feel okay thinking about Gantt charts now versus last week? How do we feel about Gantt charts? Right. So let me ask someone to do. Afia? Afia, are you there? All right. Carmen, are you there? Oh boy. All right. Roshan, are you there?
Yes, miss.
Okay, I just saw your message that it's clearer now. Was there any part of what I just said that was different from last week? Was there any specific point that I raised today that really cleared it up for you?
For me, miss, is definitely the definition. Like it
Mm-hmm.
was more spot on now than what I had in my thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So when it comes to these scheduling documents, I like to call them working documents because you use them very, very often. So you have to ensure that you keep them protected and you keep them accurate. And that's another reason why I have suggested that if you have a Gantt chart that has a lot of data on it already, don't bother trying to complicate it by having the actual and the estimate on the same one. You can have them on two separate spreadsheets or documents because um, you don't want it to get confusing to the point that you don't understand what is being said. Because if you mess up your Gantt chart or you mess up any of these scheduling documents, it's really, really difficult to restore it to where it should be and then also update it to include your updates or the changes that you've made, right? So it's very important that when it comes to your scheduling documents, you don't just use them often, but you also make sure that they are as accurate as possible because that is what you use to make day-to-day decisions, right? Where you should be versus where you need to be. So yeah, it's one of those that they get updated pretty often. The next thing we'll look at, so we're gonna step from scheduling, which was more a planning activity, into resource management. So let me know that while I said this was more planning activities because they're created in the planning stage, right? They're actually managed in the control state because yes, you make your Gantt chart in planning, but you update it very often in the control phase, right? So as we're controlling, we're looking at resource management. So what are our resources? When I asked you guys, either last week or the week before, I would have gone through like what you think resources are in projects, and some of you stated the time, some of you stated money, etc. So those are all resources: time, money, people's skill. They're all resources that we need to manage. And by manage, we mean we need to forecast for them. We need to understand where the resources are at all times, and we also need to manage how many resources we have as we go along. So with regards to resource management, what exactly is it? It's mainly knowing what you have available. It's knowing it's knowing also how, like, what you need at every point in every point of at every point of work. Like for each activity, you need to know what resources are needed for each activity. For instance, um if your office has one printer, right? And you recognize that you're going to be using the printer a lot in activity 1.1. You can't also plan to use the printer for another project running at the same time or another activity running at the same time. You probably need to say, okay, so if 1.1 needs a lot of printing and 1.2 also needs a lot of printing, then you will have to budget that 1.1 needs to be completely finished before you can even start 1.2. So yes, you do have a printer, and it would have been great for you to be able to do them both concurrently. However, you might recognize that it's not possible or it's not recommended based on what you need to do, right? So yes, you can have the resources necessary, but you also need to make sure that the resource is available, right? Another thing to note is when it comes to resources, especially if you're going to outsource them. So for instance, you have a project where you want to build a house. If you're building the house and you understand that for the next 3 weeks, you need how much ever pieces of wood, you need to make sure you have all of those planks on site. Or that your network, your supply is set up in such a way that they deliver the planks of wood to the site before it's needed. You can't plan that you will use all of the planks of wood, and then when you get to the last one, only then you're trying to order more. Why? Because ordering and delivering, most likely they're not happening on the same day. right? So forecasting is also recognizing when your resources are going to be depleted for you to refill them. And it becomes that much more important if you're going to be outsourcing and you're working with suppliers outside of your business, because negotiating with people outside is more difficult than negotiating inside. But if you're going to have everything come, so for instance, you might say, you know what? I'm going to need planks of wood for the next 3 months. You might think that it makes sense to have all those planks of wood there, but what happens if it's during the May, June season and there's a lot of rain happening and you don't have adequate protection for your wood? The wood is going to collect water, it's going to swell, it's probably going to bend, and it's going to be wasted. So you don't just manage based on how much you need, right? Because it would be great to have all of them there, but you need to look at how you're going to store it. You need to look at where you're going to store it and if it's still going to be usable by the time you need it. Because, I mean, is it even safe to have planks of wood just on the ground, especially if you're not able to protect it properly? What happens when you get to the bottom of the stack of wood and there are like 1 or 2 tiny snakes there, right? So these are all things that we need to think about when we're looking at resource management. So it's not just having it, it's having it and keeping it and storing it in a safe capacity, and also having it near to where it's going to be needed. So you're not going to be building in Georgetown and keep your supply in Berbice unless you're able to move things down very, very often, right? You're going to generally try to keep the resource nearby where the resource is needed. So these are all questions that we start thinking about when we're looking at forecasting. So while we're thinking about forecasting as just checking to see what we're going to need when we're going to need it, it's also how they're going to be used, how they're going to be stored, how many different varieties we need to use, how we're going to manage to keep name tags on each of the different types of wood so that we make sure that, okay, pine wood is used inside and the green heart is used outside, right? So don't quote me on that. I don't know where wood is used in different places, but I believe my father mentioned pine wood is for inside, like I think, right? So when it comes to these tiny details, those things, while the project manager should understand, the project manager, if they are not a subject matter expert, they need to get somebody who is, because there's certain tricks to the trade or certain things that happen inside of an industry that only people that work heavily inside of that industry will understand. I lived in Guyana my whole life. And I understand generally how to do business in Guyana and how to give people leeway based on the culture of our society. So for instance, when it comes to starting class, I understand that I'm most likely not going to be able to start class on time because I know people are coming in. They don't mean anything by it. They're not being disrespectful. It's just our culture. 50 minutes late is still on time, right? However, if you go outside of Guyana, it can be seen as very, very disrespectful to be late, like by a minute. Some cultures, it's late to be on time. You should be there a little bit before out of respect for that person. So norms, societal rules, culture, as well as the things happening inside of the business, as in the facilities and logistical support you have inside of the business. All of these things are needed within resource management. And resource management isn't just something that the project manager has to be aware of. It's also something that the team has to be aware of. And if the team don't quite understand a specific part of it, especially when it comes to forecasting, budgeting, and estimating, they should always have a subject matter expert available then. Because you don't want to, for instance, let's say I want to buy some sort of network for my company, right? I have to make sure that whatever platform or whatever program I purchase is actually usable in Guyana. Like it's something that will actually run in Guyana. It's something that Guyanese understand how to use, or I understand that I have to come in and train them on how to do it. Right? So there's some things inside of specific trades that you only understand as somebody that works in that trade. But anytime you're embarking on a project, you should have somebody on that team that has a core understanding of how that industry works. Right? So ideally, it would be the project manager, but if it's not the project manager needs to make sure that they engage an expert, a subject matter expert on that. Okay, so I pause here. I have a student trying to come in. Okay, I think, yeah, you just got in. Great. Because it was taking a little while to load there. Yeah. So when it comes to forecasting, what exactly is the definition of forecasting? Because what I did is just kind of go through resource management as a whole. Let me go to your textbook and look for. Please mute yourself unless you have a question. Okay. Okay, so I do not see. This textbook is so confusing to me. I'm looking for a page on forecasting and I can't seem to find one. Okay, so I was looking in your textbook to see if I can give you like the exact textbook definition so that I could probably test you on that, but I'm not seeing it. I'm actually really tempted right now to give you guys a second textbook to supplement your reading. So if you think a second textbook to supplement your reading would be a helpful tool, just you can like pop in and let me know, and I can also upload a second textbook for you. But okay, it seems like I'll have to actually search for the word forecasting in this book. All right, so forecasting. Okay, so I do see them covering forecasting in general planning. That is on page 415, right? Let me see if they have a good one before that. Okay. Yeah, I don't see a specific. Oh, okay. They say page 39. They covered it. Let me go up to page 39 and tell you what they say on page 39. Outside of that, I'm going to give you my own definition of what forecasting is. Okay, so no. Forecasting, how they really focus forecasting in technology. So yeah, it is on page 39, but it's mostly in technology. They're not really going through specifically what forecasting is with regards to pricing or estimating. But let me tell you what forecasting is, right? So forecasting is looking at the trend data. So we forecast based on historical data. What do I mean by historical data? Data that is already happened and proven. So if I want to buy wood from, let's say I'm buying wood from, I can't think of the name of any like actual wood shop in Guyana, but I'm buying wood from this store, right? I'm going to look at my project and try to figure out how many planks of wood I need each week. I'm going to try to make sure that I order that wood or put in my orders for the wood to come just before it's finished. So maybe on the second to last day of it being done, that's when I wanted to order. So if I am starting my week, let's say Monday, maybe I want to make sure that I get the wood for next week coming in at least by Thursday or Friday. I want to count based on expert advice how many planks of wood I'll need for each stage of building my house. I will need a different supply of wood for my foundation than I will need when I'm actually building the structure of the house. Right? So based on where you are on the project and based on what the availability is at that place, as well as how they normally operate. So are they normally late when they deliver to you? Do you have to give them extra time? Because if they're normally late, it means that you should probably order it a day or two before when you need it for you catering for them to be late, right? We also need to know what types of wood we need for which specific places. We also need to make sure that the type of wood we need for each part of our building, that we are able to forecast that ahead of time so that we know, okay, so yes, I normally use this supplier, but because I need a different type of wood for next week, I'm going to order from this supplier this week. That information, you should have already collected it at your planning stage and have that on your Gantt chart at somewhere, like ordering from this specific person, I should have those things on my Gantt chart. So I'm looking at it because I am not just forecasting based on where I think I will be. I'm also forecasting on what the current data shows me I need to do. I'm looking at the historical data to see how things normally happen so that I can make an educated guess on when it will happen on this project, so that I make sure that I avoid any pitfalls. I make sure that I avoid any bottlenecks on this current project based on the learning that I have from the previous projects, right? If I'm projecting to if I want to forecast to say that maybe my project, when I'm selling this device, maybe I'm now selling cell phones. I'm switching up my business, right? If I'm selling cell phones and I want to guess how many cell phones I'm gonna sell, I forecast based on how it's selling in the population, how other phones would have sold on the population, how many people we have in the populace. Because if within the first 3 months, I notice that I've already sold to 75% of Guyana, it means that there's only so much more sales I can possibly have because I've already saturated the market with my product. So based on not just the historical trends of how much we're selling, but also biographical data, right? Or biographical, geographical data, I can guess how my sales are going to go. So I'm putting all of the knowledge I gathered before into play now so that I can forecast for how my project is going to run in the future. Right? Outside of that, I'm also looking at my people. In activity 1, I had a specific teammate run the project and they ran it in a certain way. Maybe they didn't run it in the way that I appreciated. Maybe I didn't get the results from it I appreciated. Maybe we were really late on this project or this activity, sorry. That means I'm most likely not going to put this person in charge of another activity that looks very similar to the activity that they struggled with without giving them additional support. Right? So when it comes to forecasting, it's not just numerical data we're looking at. We aren't just looking at what actually happened. We're also looking at what we think might happen based on who else is involved in this process, right? Now, a histogram is is basically another bar chart, right? It's a bar chart, or a chart rather, just showing you historical data. So we looked at bar charts before, where we're trying to make sure that, okay, we forecast and we estimate properly. But with a histogram, you're looking at not necessarily, well, yes, necessarily historical data, but with a histogram, you're looking specifically at like discrete, or you're looking at the distribution from one point to the next, right? You aren't just looking at the actual, okay, we hit this milestone, or we hit this number this month, and that number next month. We're looking at also the variances between one part of the chart, one leg of the chart to the next leg of the chart. We're looking at the differences between there, and we're also looking at the difference between the next 2 months to see what's happening there, right? We're looking at not just the data presented, but the nuance between one data set and the next data set. I think, is it a column graph? Is it a bar graph and a column graph? Hold on. Like, it's really bothering me that I can't remember the name of the other graph. Hold on. Somebody's trying to come in. And all right, let me see. What else do we have to cover here? The last thing we have to cover here is resource loading. Yeah, it's literally telling me bar chart and column chart. Let me see what's the difference between these two. I don't know why it's bothering me so much. But yeah, the bar chart is horizontal, whereas the column chart is what even? Yeah, the column chart plotted vertically. So yeah, those are the two, bar chart versus column chart. Happy to remember that. All right, so resource loading. Does anyone want to guess what resource loading is all about? No? All right, so a resource loading graph looks very, very, very similar to your responsibility matrix. You have all of your resources stacked up, right? We have all of your resources stacked in the first column, and then you have all of the periods, as in maybe weeks or days, going across the top on a horizontal line, like on the first row. And then we're trying to see where they're needed for each part of the project. Let me get, okay, I'm gonna make a note to get a resource loading. Or you know what? Hold on, I have one coming up here already. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. Da, da, da. Yeah, a resource loading graph, it really, really, really looks like a personal calendar. I have somebody else coming in. And we're pretty much gonna go and take a little break just now. Like, I have one more set of stuff that I want us to go through. So yeah, just Google it, and this is what a resource loading graph looks like, right? This is the only one I need to show you on here. I'm sure you all know what a histogram looks like, but this is what a resource loading chart looks like. It has all of the resources that we have, so it can be people, it can also be programs. For instance, maybe you all have one computer that has a specific program loaded, like so some tasks would have a specific program that's only needed for that task. So for instance, if you are the person doing the accounting, you are most likely the only person that has to manage or work on QuickBooks, right? So maybe we will have one computer, one laptop that has QuickBooks on it. So if somebody else needs to do some quick budgeting and they need to use QuickBooks, it means that they most likely have to ask that person to borrow their system for a little while, right? So if we have that information ahead and we know they'll need to use it, we could have said that, okay, it's mostly going to be with this person for all of this time. And then for this one day, we're going to give it to somebody else, right? So really what it is a resource loading graph. It just shows you where your resources at which it projects where your resources will be at each time so that you are able to make manage and schedule your resources to be in specific places or ready for specific activities at specific times. So this is what it looks like, right? That wasn't one that I could really explain that well. So yeah. Before I head off of resource management, do any of you have any questions on what exactly resource management is or how we would use any of these tools, forecasting, a histogram, or resource loading? Okay, I'm not hearing anyone answer, so I don't know if you guys are comfortable with moving off of this topic or not. Okay, let me start calling on people then. Nandrini, how do you feel about resource management? Nandrini, are you there? Okay, no answer. Let's try Amanda. Amanda, are you there?
Yes, yes, I'm here.
All right, so how do you feel about resource management?
Miss, I understand the resource part, the available hours, but what I don't understand is these color patches with number inside.
Hmm. Oh,
Yeah, I
okay.
don't understand that part.
Okay. So what those color patches are specific, where did it go? Oh, that was crazy. Yeah, all right, so those color patches, let me go into it just tiny bit so that, right? So what we have happening here is that we're saying that these are the available hours that everybody has for the week, right? And these numbers would specifically be saying, okay, let me check if these people have numbers by their names. They don't have numbers by their names. So what I would guess is that each number here represents, okay. Okay, usually what we're doing is we're saying who would be using what machine at what day. But what this is doing is this is saying that all of these people will be using this amount of hours. So in this case here, what you're doing is you're setting up like a budget for each person. So this is 1 week, January 1st to 7th is 1 week, January 8th to the 14th is another week. So we're saying that in this week, Vincent will work 29 hours out of his 32 hours. So it's essentially this one. Think of it like a timesheet, right? So this is how many hours these different people worked on whatever day. So 36 is red because this person worked more time than they need to. These are blue because the people work less time than they need to. Orange means they worked almost the perfect amount of hours. So that's what these numbers are meaning on this specific chart that I pulled. So this one here is operating like a timesheet. It's saying, okay, these are our available people or resources. These are our available hours, and these are how many hours they've worked. So this, again, is a historical, this is historical data. It means this has already passed. This is not a forecast. Now, it could also look like them saying that we have this program, this program, this program, this program, and this program. This is the available hours, or the available hours that we have, and it can show how many hours are needed to be on each one of these, or it can also show where you have the different resources on this side, and it can just have different colors based on the different people. So maybe Vincent would be blue, this one would be green, this one would be orange, this one would be red, this one would be purple. So you can have different colors here to show who would be using which machine at which time, right? So resource loading diagrams, they look similar, but they can show up in different ways. So you can have one where you say you have different programs and you just identify who's going to be using it at which day, at which time. Or you can have one like this where it shows you the historical data of how many hours people actually worked, or how many hours we actually used the machines for. Does that make sense? Because that was a really great question. I didn't think about that because, yeah, like you can, like this diagram, it shows up in different ways based on what your project is trying to do with it. So it's a great thing that I stopped and had a question. Amanda, do you feel a little bit better about that?
Yes, Miss, I understand perfectly now.
Okay, so I'm not gonna test you. I'm not gonna ask you to like create one of these. I might give you a picture of one and ask you what it is. But I don't think I will because we spent a lot of time on it today. So it's now 6:23. We started at 5:15. I will go through one more slide and then we'll take a break. And then we'll come back and do PERT. I will have pictures of the other, like these other charts for you. If we need to answer questions on any of them, we will, but we will calculate float in an example coming up. The last thing in cost management, right? So all of this was control. What we're doing here is cost management. So as we were going through a lot of these, we were talking about resources. But the thing about resources is they usually have some sort of cost attached to them, right? Now, when it comes to cost, it, of course, it's not just financial, but it is one of the most important things that we need to manage because it can really, really, really make or break our project. On top of that, it can also make or break the respect that our team has in our abilities. Because if you allow your project to go so far over budget that you're not able to complete, it means that the entire team looks bad. If if you complete it within good time, and you keep everybody up to date, you will most likely have a better chance of running another project again, at least with the same people, right? So when we're thinking about cost management, we're not just thinking about the respect we have to have for people's finances, but we're also looking at the respect that we have to have for people's positions. So we need to know who needs to be aware of what at what point, and when we need to sound an alarm, or if we need to sound an alarm about anything. When we're talking about estimating, budgeting, control, all of these things have different official definitions. Give me 1 minute. I am trying to get closer to my computer charger. Give me a minute. Okay, great. Yeah. So all of these have their different official meanings. So I'm gonna take you through those. When it comes to estimating, what we're doing is we are trying to make sure that we have enough to cover the rest of our project. Give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. Let me go and find the textbook definitions of these words. Okay, so we do have an entire chapter on pricing and estimating. It's chapter 14 in our textbook, and it starts from page 571. I hope you guys are making notes of that. Now let me see if they have specific definitions, because I made my notes for today's class based on my own textbook. Okay. Yeah, the chapter on estimation doesn't really explain what estimation is. It takes you through how to estimate and the different types of estimation that we do. I think I need to go up to find out, to look for specific definitions. Okay, so no, it doesn't seem like the textbook goes through like an actual definition of what estimating is. But estimating is guessing how, well, not guessing, but getting a subject matter expert's opinion on exactly what you need at each stage of your process. So you're looking at your activities in your planning stage, and you're estimating how many people you need, how many skills you need, how much money you need at specific points in time, right? So estimating is more for things that don't have an actual cost or a defined cost. So think about labor. Budgeting is where you are now recognizing what you actually have. Estimating is what you want to have for each stage of your project. Each stage of your each activity, you're estimating how much you need to complete those stages and to complete them well. That's estimation. It's the first thing that you do. So you all are looking at this course and you're estimating what you think your actual grade might be. When you get closer, and you started getting your first sets of grades, you start then budgeting how much more you need to get where you need to be. So in budgeting, you're looking at what you actually have. And this is where we start to recognize our actual limitations. Because in estimating, you want to guess that you will be able to complete everything in the best possible way, right? So you're estimating based on historical facts and expert opinion. In budgeting, we're actually looking at established facts. What do we have available? Yes, we need to have these 5 different programs. However, we're only able to afford 3 of the programs, right? So how do we get around that? So in budgeting now, we're recognizing that we have constraints. And in budgeting, we're taking those constraints into consideration. And we're recognizing, okay, so we can put this much here, we can put this much there. Controlling is when we recognize that, okay, we're forgetting about the estimates. We're looking at our budget, right? In control, we're making sure that we are where we need to be. We're looking at our actual versus our budgeted. So in control, we're starting to take real data into consideration. In budgeted, we kind of started to take it into consideration with having an overview of what we wanted to have by each stage based on what we established that we actually have an inventory of. But in controlling, we're making sure that these resources are actually placed in the right place at the right time, and that they're also functioning in the right capacity. Because yes, you can buy the program, but what happens if the program doesn't work in a way that you want, or if it doesn't include a tool that you thought it did? So in controlling is where we recognize what is actually happening and we take steps to get us to complete the activity in time, right? We're making decisions on how to actually manage the cost a little bit before it becomes dire for us to control that cost and it gets out of control, right? When it comes to cost planning and resource planning, they go back into using our estimating and our budgeting, right? They go back in there to recognize, okay, we have this much cost, these many cost centers, and this is how we plan to utilize or manage the cost that we're going to be accumulating as we run the project. So we thought that we would be spending this much on wood as we go through the project, right? We had those estimates and that budget already there, but we're now collecting the actual data and making sure that we're in the right place at the right time. And with resource planning, we're doing the same thing. We're in our in this stage, resource management, right? In forecasting, histogram, resource loading, you are making this information a little bit ahead of time, but also, especially with like resource loading, you're making it afterwards, right? So some of them, forecasting is us doing it ahead. Histogram is us taking into consideration what happened before us. Resource loading is recognizing what's happening generally kind of in real time and sometimes just after. When we move to the cost management, it's doing resource loading. Yeah, basically we created these charts here. And in here, we're actually maintaining where we are and making estimations on what else we need to be, where else we need to be. So when we've got our Gantt chart, we have all these different charts that we've created. We are managing, budgeting, and we're continuously planning and making changes. So yes, we plan in the planning stage, but then you still have to make changes as you go along executing the actual project. So cost planning continues to happen throughout the project. Resource planning continues to happen throughout the project, even though they were essentially outputs of our planning stage, but we still have to continue to plan because things continue to happen in our project. Right, I wish I had like specific definitions for you on these, but I can't seem to find them in this textbook. I do have them in my other textbook, but you guys didn't say that you want that textbook, so that's cool. But I'm gonna stop here and I'll ask if we have any questions or if there was anything that I discussed here that you want me to come back with some more information about, or maybe some graphical representation of beyond the charts. Like, was there anything that we discussed today that you're not quite clear on, or any queries that you have at this point in time? No queries? All right. Okay. So we don't have any queries. I'm gonna stop here and you can go take a break. How long do you guys want on a break? I noticed last week we did 50 minutes. But the weeks before we did about 20 minutes to half an hour. How long do you guys want to take a break for?
Miss, you could come back at 7.
Come back at 7. All right, so we're coming back at 7. Nobody objected. So let's go take a break and we come back at 7 o'clock. And I'll have that ready for you. Right. So here. So I was telling you about the different charts that we use to schedule. So we know what the Gantt chart looks like because we are making that one. So when it comes to the tabular report, this is what a tabular report looks like. Hold on, bring forward. What are you doing? Okay, so when it comes to a tabular report, okay, bring forward again. This is what we're doing. We are recognizing what is happening. So we're saying that this is what our houses should look like when we finish. This is what our inventory should look like, whatever it is. So it's basically just a table with some information. It could be anything. We've got a mean, a min, and a max. So your mean is going to be the average, right, between all of whatever variables you have. You've got a minimum for what the lowest on the scale looks like usually. And then you've got a maximum for the highest in that scheme. So if you were creating this in, let's say, Microsoft Excel, we know for our mean is going to be equal average because average is mean. Average and mean, same thing. For min, we would literally just type equal min, and it's going to give you the lowest in the range, and then equal max is going to give you the highest in the range. So any table that you have that generally looks like this and gives specific insight into something is a tabular report, right? We're reporting on the prices of houses. Could be houses that we're building. It could be houses that we're estimating to build. So that's one. The next thing we have is a logic bar chart. So let me bring this one forward before I make it larger. So when we look at this, what we're seeing is that we've got different colors, one. So we look at the chart, the key, sorry. You see blue is east, right? We look on the side here, we see transactions. So within the east, we made this amount of sales on these different months. Right, so in April, we had 4.09K. Then for May, we had 3.79. In June, we went up a little bit, right? Then we've got here central. So this is how much we're selling in the east. This is how much we're selling in central of the city, maybe. And then this is how much we're selling on the west. So think East Bank, West Bank, Central, Central Georgetown. So what we're doing here is we're looking at these three variables over a period of time, and we're looking at the changes relative to each other. So how did we perform this quarter? Well, it's not quarter. This is like 2 quarters and something. So we want to know how we did this quarter in the past, between April to November. We plot it all on a chart and we look at it. So when you look at it, you can see how you did. We can see that we started here. We went slightly up, then we went up a little higher, and then we stayed the same. So it's a straight line. Then we go down a little bit, and then we go down a little bit more, but then we went up for the last two, right? Now, that is what a logic bar chart will look like. It's a bar chart, and it has data that we can actually read and make sense of. You can read these numbers and recognize, okay, we're making sales, or we're recognizing something, and we're recognizing how these numbers change over time, right? So we're looking at it and we're reading. So in the report, we put it in a table form and we're reading for your logic bar chart. We've got a bar chart that has additional data here for us to directly read, and so we're reading that. When it comes to Excel, there's a whole function that we can use to customize charts, and in customizing charts, you can make sure that you display data on top of charts and not just like at the bottom, but you can make sure that you do put those labels right on the chart, right? So all of those are different functions that we do in Excel. For this one is our line of balance. If you look at it, you'll actually notice that this is essentially a Gantt chart, right? So if you just replace these two first columns, you replace it with the information on your Gantt chart, it looks very much like this. So what we're doing is we had a forecast of where we want it to be, and then we just create some lines to show how we're moving along the path, right? So we're putting a line graph on top of another scheduling graph to make sure that we're going in a positive direction, or so that we can see what the direction, what the line looks like. So that same thing I did, where on this other chart, I was just moving from one and I went up a little bit and then I went down and then I went back up. In that same path, I could have drawn it as a line, right? So we're just putting a line of balance on top of another scheduling graph because we're trying to understand exactly where we stand on this project at this point in time. So that's our example of how these charts look, right? So on scheduling, do we have any more questions on how these charts are supposed to look? Like, I should probably put activity float a little bit lower, so that you can just see all of the charts in line. Any questions on any of our charts? No? All right. So then I'm expecting that we all understand how our charts work, right? So we create our charts in our planning phase, and then we manage them throughout our control phase, right? Now, the next thing that we're doing in our control phase is we are looking at a few different activities. So when it comes to estimating, I did go back and I did find the definitions of these based on my text. And so I'm just going to go through these just really quick. When it comes to estimating specifically, it's determining the approximate costs of the resources needed to complete project activities. I'm reading word for word. Budgeting, we're aggregating the estimated costs of individual activities or work packages to establish an authorized project baseline. So in estimating, again, we are looking to see just how much it's going to cost. We're looking to build a house. We're looking at, okay, my friend built a house last month. Let me go and see what her house cost. My aunt built a house 2 months ago. Let me see how much her house cost, right? I understand that the cost of material has changed from then to now. I understand that the cost of labor may have changed. I understand that my scheduling does need to look a little bit different because right now we're building in May, June, so we have a lot of rain, and we know that we can't lay down concrete and stuff like that when we have rain falling. We have to monitor our sunlight to know when we do. So especially like starting that project where we're making the foundation of the house or whichever building we're doing, right? So we need to make sure that we've got dry enough weather there to, one, get everything set in before rain comes down, two, dry it before rain comes down, right? So we're estimating based on historical data and based on, usually, please get a subject matter expert involved when you're estimating so that you have a good projection of what your cost will be. Because remember, we do not want to start a project and not be able to finish it. When it comes to budgeting, why we use the word aggregating is that we know that, yes, you can estimate and say that, yes, this house is going to cost you $3 million. Do you have $3 million? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you have half of it now and you'll get the rest of it later. If you get the rest of it later, great. It means that you can project out in such a way that by the time you get to needing that money, it's actually readily available to you, right? So in budgeting, you know what is available to you at which periods those resources will become available to you, and you are then trying to divide it up ahead of time. If you know your printer is on its last legs and the majority of printing you need to do is at the beginning of the project, you will most likely estimate the majority of printing within the first 2-3 months of that project, right? So based on what you have to do and what you have available, this is where you actually say, this is how much you get, this is how much you get, and this is how much this activity is getting, right? So estimating, we're hopeful. In budgeting, we are recognizing what we have and we're moving with logic. We're not moving with hope here. We're moving on what we actually see available to us. In controlling, what we're doing is we're monitoring the status of the project. And we're trying to update our costs. We're trying to update our baselines. We're trying to update all of our resource planning. We're trying to update things to make sure that, okay, so we had a change in activity 2. How does it affect the rest of my project? Does it only affect activity 2? Does it affect 2 and 4? Or does it affect 2, 4, 7, and 9? Right? Controlling is looking at the bigger picture. And the next one, we're looking at cost planning. For cost planning, it's simply establishing policies, procedures, documentation for planning, managing, expending, and controlling costs. So anything to do with money, especially money, right? How much you have to pay for specific things. So one of the costs that you might not be thinking about, if you're going to build a house, you need to pay, I don't remember what that place is, but there's a place in Durban Backlands where you go to like, I think it's where you go to get like a transport for your land. It's also, is that where you go to get your blueprint for your house approved? And in the blueprint, they tell you things like you've got to make sure that you get at least 2 doors, so that, you know, you've got 2 exits for the building. So when you go to these different places, costs will add up. So all of those smaller costs, those admin costs, you might not be thinking about it when you are going through the planning phase of that of your project, right? So if you have somebody that's very, very intimate with the topic that you're looking to build, they'll probably tell you, okay, you need this much for material, you need this much for labor, and you need this much for admin costs, like dealing with labor, etc., etc. You might have somebody to tell you that, versus you might have somebody that has knowledge of it, but they aren't that deep into maybe house building. What do you call that? Construction. So maybe they tell you generally you need money for this and you need money for that. So maybe you look at raw materials and you look at labor. So the things that you'll find on that estimate that a builder would give you or a contractor. But then when you actually go to do it, you recognize that there's all these additional costs. So if you can't draw your own blueprint, you have to pay somebody to make the blueprint for your house, and it can get very expensive. You also have to print that blueprint, right? So you need to find somebody that has one of those big printers to print it out for you and roll it up and then take it into that place to get it approved, right? You got to also budget. Something that a lot of people don't budget for is their own time, especially if you have another job. So if you have a job and you're building your house, you have to budget. First of all, you're losing all your lunch breaks for a little while from just having to call people and negotiate back and forth. But then there are times where you might have to take a day off of work to go to the bank to collect money for the next phase of your building if you're using a loan, right? You might find that you estimated to have this much for your housing, but then as you start to build the house, you notice, I don't like those cupboards. Maybe I want to go to this person that does cupboard doors specifically and get some nice customized doors, and you change the cost. So with cost planning, you're looking to holistically manage all the costs of of the project, and not just in the scheduling phase or in the planning phase, but also very much so in the actual execution phase of that project. Why? Because sure, we estimated to use $300,000 to buy wood planks, but you might need more than that. Or you might not. You might have some extra, right? So dealing with costs going up and down is something that you have to do in a project, because it can really make and break your ability to submit that project on time. Now, the last one here was resource planning. So that's determining which resources, specifically people, equipment, and materials are needed and in which quantities they should be used. So sure, we bought the wood in cost planning, but how much wood do we need for the foundation versus how much do we need to put up walls versus how much do we need to build separations on the inside, like inside walls. We need different wood for outside versus inside. Outside wood needs to be probably cured or something to manage the weather patterns in Guyana. Well, actually, no, people don't really, I don't know. I don't think people make like a lot of houses with wood. Actually, I don't think I've seen a lot of new houses with wood. I usually see concrete. So you probably just need for like reinforcement. Yeah, but you really would need wood on the inside of the house, right? I think most people still do like wood for separations on the inside. So you need to know, okay, so if the house, so as the project manager or the contractor, because contractors that build house are project managers, even though they don't call themselves that, right? But a contractor would know, okay, if you got kids, you probably can't do plyboard walls because they can probably run straight through that. Versus, if it's just two older folks just trying to live the rest of their life out in peace, then yeah, they can go for walls that might not need that much reinforcement because they understand that you can't just throw yourself into a wall, right? But with kids, you can't do that. The same way when you have a kid, you just remove glass. Like I'm trying to find practical examples that people will understand. Yeah. So these are the kind of questions that we look at and we think about when we're going through both our planning phase and our execution phase, because we're looking to see what we have available now and make sure that we have enough available to complete everything in a specific period of time. The very next thing we have to look at today is activity management. So when we went through projects, I told you guys that in your project, if you're using the traditional method of project management, you would have your activities, or you have your full project, right? So maybe above a project, you have a program. So maybe the program is that we are trying to, in the program, maybe we're trying to build a new community, right? So the first project is we're building the roads. We're developing the lands to build the roads. Second project, we start building houses. So in the second project, the first one is passed on time, great. So that was the first iteration. Well, in traditional project management, that would have been a separate project within the program. So building setting up the foundation of the land, while developing the land, building the houses, building any additional facilities like a community center, maybe a school, maybe a health center. Those are things that you might do in the like second, third, fourth, fifth cycle of this project, right? So you've got one big program, build a community, and then within the program, you've got multiple different projects happening. Each one of the projects are happening one after the other. We're not trying to do too much at once, right? So that's your program, that's your project. Within each project, now you have activities. The first activity is probably build the foundation. The next activity is build the outside of the house. The third activity is build the walls on the inside. Now, this is, again, not factual information. I do not know what it takes to build a house like that. I'm just pulling from what I know. But in those different activities, I will have tasks. For instance, putting on the foundation means I've got to dig that big hole. It means I got to get like those little wire things that stand up. I don't remember what you call them. I don't even think I know what you call them. So you're building the foundation, and they got all these different things you've got to put into building the foundation. So those are your different tasks in order to build the foundation. Once the foundation is done, we move on to activity 2, which is putting up the walls. And then, you know, we do all the different tasks in that. So your activity is going to be activity 1, and the task is going to be task 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. We learned this when we were doing our work breakdown structure, right? Now, if your project was not the traditional method of project management and instead the agile method of project management, it would look slightly different, right? Instead of having different projects, you'd have different iterations. So yes, we still got one big program at the top, but you got one iteration where you're saying the first iteration is building the foundation and everything that it takes for that. When you finish that, it's pretty much like finishing a whole project, and then we close off and we move to the next one. So what that does is it closes off doing things like your lessons learned at every phase, not every phase, but every iteration, rather than how we worked it in traditional, where we move to the end of it and then we do your lessons learned at the end of the entire project when the full house is built, right? Whereas if you use agile, when we finish the foundation, we stop, we make sure that, okay, we're great. Like, do we want to keep, like, now we start planning for the second iteration. Whereas in the traditional, we would have planned for all the different phases, from building the foundation to the walls, etc. We would have planned all of that in our planning phase, right? So what we're doing is we're running one iteration, we're stopping, planning again, running a separate iteration, stopping, planning again, third iteration. Those are 2 different ways that we run projects. But it really depends on what type of project, because you'll find iterations mostly with like IT projects, whereas traditional projects, things like construction and so forth, they still kind of fall into the traditional method of doing things. Okay. So in activity management, how we manage activities is going to be heavily dependent on what type of project it is. If it's like all of what we're doing here, it really depends on us doing a traditional method, right? So for our PERT stands for Program Evaluation Review Technique. And what it does is every single thing we need to do for the program, we have it there, from activity 1 straight to activity how much ever we have. We plot them all on one graph, and we look at that full network diagram. Our critical path method is simply recognizing where our critical path is on our activity diagram and making decisions accordingly. Our third one is our precedence diagramming method, PDM. And what that does is it says that, you know, one activity is done and then you move to the next activity. Basically, with precedence, we're trying to understand what needs to be completely done before something else, because we probably have to use what was done in that last activity to do the next activity. So you can't build the walls of the house without finishing the foundation of the house, right? So that's precedence. The precedence there is that the foundation of the house must be done before you start putting up those the wire things again on the 4 corners of the house and outside to make those pillars that go around the house, right? So precedence, usually it follows logic. So last week we talked about a logical framework analysis. That's understanding what needs to be done when, based on logic. So in this case, we'd be using logic to know which activities have what precedence. And when it comes to precedence, we have different levels of precedence, right? I really should have made a note of that when when I was writing this up, because now I gotta go find it. The only other one, okay, so the other thing is that your critical path method, sometimes you see it called the arrow diagram method. Yeah, arrow diagram is really just those arrows. You usually have the arrow in a different width or a different color to say which ones are along the critical path. But yeah, critical path method is also sometimes called in really old textbooks the arrow diagram method. I mention this because it's in your textbook. Yeah. So those are some of the major terms you do need. There was one thing I wanted to find. I wanted to find the different types of precedences based on your textbook. So your textbook does have a whole area here, 12.12. Let me tell you what page it is. It's page 523. Make a note, 523 in your textbook. They go through precedence networks, and they do talk about things that you need to look at. So what project will be affected by what resources, what projects will change requirements, etc. And they do mention that you have to look at things based on, for instance, whether weekend activities, unleveled manpower. So where do you have people available to actually do the things, right? So why does this textbook, I find this textbook to be so confusing so unnecessarily. What is the point? Okay. So when it comes to precedence, hold on, give me 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. So when it comes to precedence, we usually go in the direction of finish to start. So step A needs to be finished before we can before step B can be finished. So for instance, we need to finish our foundation before we can finish our walls. Essentially, we need to finish our foundation, hopefully before we start our walls. But I actually don't know if you maybe need the concrete a little bit soft to put down those like the 4 corner planks. I'm not sure, right? But the first type of dependence simply is that we have step A that needs to be finished before step B can be finished. The next one is, so that's finish to start, right? The next one is finish to finish, and that basically states that step A needs to be finished before okay, so finish to start is step A needs to be finished before step B can be started. The next one is step A needs to be finished before step B can be finished. And then the final one is step A needs to be started before step B can be finished. So finish to start, then finish to finish, and then start to finish. Hope that makes sense. So in the final one, start to finish, it could be a situation where maybe maybe step A takes a very long time, and you need something in step B to be finished that goes into step A. Maybe.
Question is,
Yeah, go ahead.
so I totally agree. But when it comes to phases, if I could recall correctly, the two of them that some company might use or project engineer might use is the waterfall method or the ALIG method. Would that be incorporated what you're currently seeing, step-by-step method? I know some steps duration would have been laying over to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to clear out which one would fall.
So waterfall is what we use in traditional project management before we came up with Agile. Let me Google waterfall method. Like waterfall method, it was very, very similar to what Agile is now. Hold on, let me Google it to find the exact one, what they say, right? So they're saying that waterfall methodology is recognized as a structured and sequential approach. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. So let me look for a waterfall method versus agile, right? So yeah, we use agile, we use Scrum, like there are lots of different types of project management. So waterfall is sequential and rapid, right? So you move from one, yeah, that's it. You move from one phase straight into the next, into the next, into the next, right? And they're all distinct phases that are completed in order. Now that is actually very, very similar to what we do in traditional, right? But what they're saying here is that sometimes in traditional project management, we have one task that's leading into the next task, and they're all kind of working concurrently together. Whereas with the waterfall method, you do one, you finish it, you do the next one, you finish it, you do the next one, you finish it. And so what agile is the same thing, but you're thinking that you're doing it in a longer way. So like waterfall, it would be appropriate if you do it in like maybe you're running as like a marketing program at a company. And so every month you are running a different type of promotion. So you run one promotion really quick, you stop it, you run another promotion, you quick, you stop it. And so each of those, while it builds on each other's momentum, it doesn't actually mean that you need like they don't necessarily have that much to do with each other. It could be very different projects you're running in between, right? Whereas with agile, it's usually for a longer basis. And you use agile in a case where like I mentioned it specifically for like IT projects, because a lot of times what you find agile trying to do is so there's another type of, so one project management qualification that you can get, that was the one I told you guys about. That's the one from PMI. And PMI concerns itself, yes, with agile, but mostly with traditional. And then there is the Lean Six Sigma that does a lot of agile, because what they're concerned with is like continuous development. So you're doing a lot of times in agile, you're doing the same thing over and over. So think about a case where you have an IT company and like I build LMS, so leadership, not leadership, learning management software programs for different people. So I could have 5 different customers or 5 different clients that I'm working with over the next year. And each of them know that for 3 months of the year, I'll be working on each of their projects. But I'm pretty much doing the same thing over and over. So what I'm doing is I'm working with the first company. They will have their specifics on how their LMS platform should look. I do that, develop it, integrate it, make sure it works, send that off. Right. And I'm learning from that to build the next platform for the next person, even though that next person will have some different requirements. Right. And then when I stop this one, I, meet with my team, everybody's good. We learn some new things in that one, and then we do it again. So what you're doing is you're doing it over and over in order to learn how to do it better. And also really to focus on one specific project at a time. But a lot of it is for continuous development. So that's mostly what we do in Agile. It takes a lot. It's like for very long projects with a lot of collaboration. Whereas with Waterfall, we're usually working mostly with one team. It's very similar to our traditional, but it moves very, very rapidly from one to the next. But yeah, there are lots of different types of project management or different types of projects that you can look up. So your textbook does have, I believe your textbook has them. Let's see if your textbook has, yeah, so I see 135 options for it. Let me see in the heading if they have it, but I'm pretty sure they should at least have types of projects in this book. Does anybody have any other questions while I'm looking into this? Yeah, I'm not finding that, but I'm sure they should have it somewhere. The other type of a project that I should mention um is our white elephant projects. So you know, a lot of times well, not a lot of times, but there was an old saying that I heard. Sure you guys probably heard it too, but sometimes they say, oh, there's like a white elephant in the room. And it's usually just maybe somebody that sticks out or somebody that the group doesn't identify with. Um, but in project management, it's similar. So a white elephant project is one that is probably most likely not going to ever finish, but we have invested a lot of money into it. So it was a mega project that just never finished. So funny enough, like no shit to anyone, but you find it often happening in the government and not like the government of Guyana, or like in Guyana specifically, but just across the world. White elephant projects are usually projects by people who have very little to lose, because they never actually finish, but they take a big chunk of resources, and just keep going on and on until they just eventually it eventually just closes. Um, and they find another use for whatever it was. But
Miss,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
question. So you're saying is that white elephant is a term used in project management as in a legal documentation something?
Mm-hmm.
Oh shoots.
Google white elephant projects.
No, I worked on one, so I'm just confirming that yes.
Yeah, so I do. Okay, they have different types of organizations like listed out here, like different types of organizations that projects can run in, but I am not seeing information on specifically different types of projects, but I really thought that they most likely have it somewhere in this book. Let me see if I can Google white elephant and it comes up. Just elephant. Um,
Hi, good evening, Miss.
Hi.
Hi, Sheldon here. So within that context of white elephant, would that not be a project maybe which was established for a particular purpose, but maybe due to delays, it was unable to be completed,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that it's no longer useful um, for this particular event, I may say.
Exactly.
So it's now left there, and then you have to find a different purpose for it as opposed to its intended purpose
Yep.
or
That's what
initial
it is,
purpose.
right?
Yeah.
So it could be what elephant projects usually fall into categories. One, it could be one that fails to deliver, like they just never finished it. It just wasn't possible to finish. Maybe you started building a road and then you reached a river and you didn't bother building a bridge. But for whatever reason you were not able to complete the deliverables of that project. Or two, when it's done, it actually serves no useful project. Like it's no longer useful. So, a fun example I like to think about, we all have things that we like that went obsolete at some point. My father loved cassettes for whatever reason. I hated the rolling it backward. But I do remember that when we moved from cassette to CDs, yeah, that was ecstatic. Like he was so excited about that. And he always would buy CDs in like those batches with like a stack of CDs, and we would mix music and videos and whatever we wanted at home, pictures and whatever from the family. We keep it on CDs. And one year he came back, like usually when he bought it, he'd have to share it with like me and my siblings. And I mean, it was four of us. We all were at school, like we're using out his CDs. He had, you know, he'd get upset, but we'd use it for whatever reason. And then one year he traveled and he came back with like a lot. Like he brought a lot because he really wanted us to he wanted to make sure that he had enough CDs for whatever he wanted. Um, and I remember thinking, like, why did he buy more CDs? Because like flash drives had just come out, and I remember somebody had given my mom one at work. She didn't want it, and she gave it to me. And so I recognized pretty easily that flash drives are completely going to, it's going to completely cripple the CD business. And so like I talked with him about it and he was like, oh no, like cassettes still stayed around for a while even though they had CDs, but we all know what happened. So his CDs pretty much were just a white elephant in the house. Like we would toss it from room to room just because we just really weren't using it anymore. And you know, kids are kids. But what elephant projects could be that one, it fails to deliver, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, or two, by the time you actually get it, it just has no use in society anymore because whatever purpose it was coming to solve, we found new technology or a new method to do it more efficiently. Right? But the thing with white elephant projects is that they're usually very, very expensive. Like that is the thing that makes it a white elephant project. What was I saying before? I don't feel like I said white elephant. Anyways, that's the difference between a white elephant project and just a failed project. Like we have failed projects that happen all the time. Actually, the majority of projects fail or are delivered late, like the majority of them. But white elephant projects specifically are usually very, very expensive. Like that is the major thing that makes it an elephant versus just a failed project. All right. So based on that or anything else that you guys were reading and found interesting, is there anything else you want to talk about with regards to just cost management or the general control of working in a project environment? No questions? Nobody has any thoughts? Okay. So if you don't have any more, questions.
There are
Mhm.
projects in across Guyana. I mean, a lot of persons here might know one or two. But like Mr. Sheldon mentioned, sometimes they do build a net for that sole purpose or because of financial stuff. One that I recall growing up seeing is this place next to this ferry stand going.
Hey. Don't call no names. This is recorded, right? It goes out. Don't call out anybody's specific projects. Right? I feel like as Guyanese, we've all seen white elephant projects and we all have a general idea of what we're talking about. But like with projects, you should have been able to, in your scheduling and in your planning, make sure that you have enough money, enough resources, and enough usefulness for everything that you put your money into. But we understand that, with people don't always follow rules. And that's why, as project managers, it's so important for us to understand our team, and that our team is competent enough to do what we do. Because sometimes we depend on experts that we don't necessarily know. Like I remember working on one project, and I asked somebody else was consulting with my overseas team on developing something, and the numbers they brought to me were just very, very weird. And it just didn't make sense. But then when I looked into it, what they did is they used I think it was Canadian dollar figures that they used for the estimate, and they converted it down to Guyana dollars, but used the US exchange rate. Right? So instead of recognizing that it was Canadian dollars, they recognized it as US dollars and converted that down into Guyana dollars. So it didn't make sense. Right? But had I gone ahead with that project, I could have ended up in a situation where, one, I could have sent the budget to the client and the client rejected because it was, they call it bloated, and assume that I'm trying to steal from them. Or I could have started and then at the end of it, just have all this extra money and, have to go through embarrassingly telling the client that, what our mistake was. And it wouldn't be an issue if you overcharge, but it would be very much an issue if you were to undercharge, right? And like Canadian dollars are lower than US dollars. So in that case, it wouldn't have made much of a difference because we would have just had an excess. But if it was the opposite, we could have been in a situation where the project would have been shorted. And if we had the client sign to that number, we have to deliver to that number. And so we would have had to deliver on our own costs, right? So it's very important to understand just the nuances around projects, whether they're successful or they fail. But every project has its own reasons to be successful or fail. So yes, we can think of examples, but let's not call them out. Okay. So the other thing I do need to mention is in estimating, right? So in estimating, we usually estimate based on three major ways, right? One, we can estimate in an optimistic manner. So we can assume that everything will go according to plan, with as little bottlenecks as possible. And then we could possibly, run into a situation where we run out of time if we're a bit too optimistic and too hopeful. There's also the pessimistic way, where you're assuming that almost everything will go bad, right? So whatever will go bad, whatever could go bad will go bad. And in that way, what you're doing is you are estimating with a lot of float and a lot of slack. Of course, there's no float and slack on your your critical path, but we do recognize that you can be optimistic in your planning, or your estimating, and you can also be pessimistic in your estimating. Or alternatively, we can also be most likely, right? So there's the optimistic way, the pessimistic way, and most likely. Now, most likely only works if you have a project manager. Well, you have a topic expert. A subject matter expert on your team, because that person is going to be able to give you direct functional information on how this will go. I can guess that it takes you $4 or $5 million to build a house if you already have the land for it. But somebody who is currently working construction will probably be able to give you an even better estimate. And further, I could be very, very wrong, right? But I am not a subject matter expert. So in my head, I have to know as the project manager how my team works. Are they usually on time? Are we usually able to complete everything on time? Usually we're able to complete a house during the dry seasons. Like, let's think, well, it rains in December, but it's usually dry from like early in the year. So let's think before April. So before April, I can probably get a house built in like, I don't know, maybe a month. I can budget that I'll get a house built, versus knowing that I have to put some extra time over the summer because I have to budget for rain, right? So it's not just your people, it's also the context, it's also the season. All these different things come into how you estimate. And it also is very much dependent on the client that you're dealing with. You might have clients that want as little as possible time, but you don't want to put your team in a position where they cannot function within whatever time you choose. So while we have most likely pessimistic and optimistic options for our estimating, we should probably use estimates based on the skill level and the resources available to our team. We should also make sure that we have slack on most of our steps off of the critical path, if not all. Right? I know I went off a little bit there, but does that answer the question?
Yes, miss. Yes, miss. That's fine.
Okay, great. All right. So then that takes us into the next part of our course, which is just recognizing float. Now, when we're recognizing float, we have to plan for different types of float. So yeah, I used up my time chatting and now I need to find my notes on float. Just give me a minute. Let me go find it. So with different types of float, we have usually our free float and our total float. So our total float is going to be the total amount of float that we have on the project as a whole. Whereas the free float is going to be how much float we have on one specific activity, right? So when you look, if you have 9 activities, you just add up the float that is available on each individual part or each individual phase of, well, not phase, but each individual activity, you add all of those floats up, and that gives you your total float. But how much float you have on one specific activity or how much time you can delay one specific activity by, that one is called your free float. Yeah. So the last thing that we need to cover here is your acceleration of a project. Usually we accelerate a project by crashing it. Can anybody guess how we crash projects? Like somebody that I haven't heard from today. What do you think crashing a project is? Anybody can speak, or I'll just call someone out. All right. Asaf, have you spoken for the night? Are you there? Okay, what about Candace? Are you there?
Yes, Miss. Good evening.
Hi. What do you think crashing a project is?
Well, I'm not sure, but I'm just thinking, is it something that is condensed into a shorter frame time?
So if you were to look at everything we've learned so far on like just projects and specifically our area network diagram, right? So we understand that on the project there's like a critical path that you have to complete, right? So how do you think we could possibly crash a project while making sure our critical path is considered?
Miss, that I don't know.
No problem. So what we would do then is we ensure that to crash a project, basically, you are doing your critical path and only the things that are necessary along that path. So maybe halfway into your project, you realize you don't have enough time, you don't have enough money, whatever the case is. To crash a project, you must complete everything along the path, and you shorten it by using as much of that slack as you can. Right? So that's what your slack is there for. It's to give you a chance to hurry this project up if you need to. So you can reduce slack times, or you can, if you really, really need to, just run across the critical path and then just mark it complete. Or the other thing you can do is resource load, right? Pack as many activities on top of each other as you possibly can. So I'll take you from through your textbook on, I'll start from dependencies, and I'm just going to explain what's happening on here, right? So I'll move you to this one, but that's what crashing your project really, really entails. So let me go to the textbook. And so we're
Yes.
here.
Yes, miss. Going back to the critical part, right? Now, for the critical path analysis, I think how it's done, is from activities leading into other activities. And I also think that there is a calculation you use to actually determine where you have your slack time. Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that in all cases you are going to have a slack. It depends on the dependency of the deliverables.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have, let us say, you have to lay a foundation, and due to deplorable weather conditions, you have a delay there, automatically that is going to affect your slack time, because you'll have to spend more time working on that particular deliverable before you could actually move forward with the project.
Mm-hmm. So here's what. If it comes to something like a foundation, it would most likely be on your critical path. If you can't go forward without doing it, it would most likely fall along your critical path. And the calculation you're talking about there to find your slack is the backward forward pass. Right. So yeah, you you cannot complete a project without completing your critical path. The things on your critical path usually have no slack. And the ones off of your critical path do have slack. So yeah, you can shorten your slack times wherever you can. You can pile activities on top of each other to complete it. But the things along your critical path, if they are not completed, your project is not completed. It's not successful. Right? So when we think about dependencies, right, that's what you were talking about there. Dependencies, it would be, okay, so when we read here, we see they're mandatory, they're discretionary, and then they're external. So external dependencies would be things that are out of the control of the project manager. So when we were talking earlier about supply chains, right? The project manager cannot control when the supplier brings wood. We have to hope that they come on time as scheduled. We can plan for things being late with them, but it's not within our control. So that dependency is completely external. It's not something we can control within the project. Discretionary dependencies, though, we do have some control over those ones. And so those ones are things that change from project to project. And it could be simple things like maybe we were planning to run some additional activities. We might not be able to actually run those activities. Maybe we wanted to put some additional things in if we have time. Maybe we don't have time to do that. Maybe some of the functionalities we wanted to put into this program, we can't put it in right now. Maybe we can hope to put it in later. But for whatever reason, discretionary, because of time, because of limited resources, whatever it is, we can't work on that right now. But then there is the hard dependencies. And those are things that you absolutely need to do. So when you read here, they do mention things like creating the walls of a house before putting up the roof. You have to do the walls before the roof. So in that case, that is a mandatory thing you need to do. It's hard logic. It's a mandatory dependency. We have to do it before we move on to the next phase of that project. Discretionary, we can shorten it. We can change some of the deliverables inside, but it's within our control whether we can do it or not. Our customer wants all of it, but maybe we can't give all of it. So before you make a change at the discretionary level also, you do need to let your customer know. So maybe you're not telling them, listen, maybe you can't tell them you definitely can't tell them you're going to remove something you agreed to give them, but you can give them a choice. Listen, what you're asking for, we can either lessen the scope, like cut it out of the scope, or we can increase the budget, right? You leave the choice on the customer. So the customer tells you, listen, I really want that thing. Make sure, go ahead and put it in and I will deal with that additional cost. Or you know what, the cost isn't worth it for me. Let's leave that off and move forward. So yes, the control is the discretion is within the team on how we deal with this dependency, but for the sake of transparency, especially if you have a client that's paying money, you should at least let them know that you're going to make a change to whatever scope it is on the document. on the project, sorry. And then the final one is those external dependencies that you can't do anything about. You just be letting them know, listen, there was an issue with the supplier. They're not going to be able to bring the wood today, so we won't be able to move forward and do the other part of it today. We're going to do it tomorrow when the wood comes in. It's outside of my control. There is nothing I can do. If I had another option, I would have taken it. And further, I'm going to make sure that I always order 2 days ahead instead of just 1 day ahead. So it isn't just telling them this is a hiccup that I'm experiencing, it's also letting them know how you plan to deal with that hiccup in the future. Right? So those are how you kind of think about how you're going to, what you can actually crash or what you can use some of your slack time on and what you can't. Right? You can also use Slack if it's a case where you do something and then it just wasn't done right. Like maybe you did it to different specifics. We don't like how it looked. Maybe the part doesn't fit. Maybe we created this circuit for the machine and the circuit doesn't work. So we've got to do it again and we've got to use money again. Different things happen in our projects that we have to make decisions on. Some of the decisions we can make in-house. Some of them we can some of them we have to go outside to get it clarified, and sometimes it's just completely outside of our control and we have to just work with what we have, right? So those are the dependencies and discretions that you usually take when it comes to budgeting and estimating. But we will continue. Like I'm going through our textbook here. So our textbook talks about dependencies and then we move into slack time, right? So with slack time, they're telling us that since there's only one path throughout the network that is the longest, that is usually a critical path, right? Which the path is usually equal to in length, or what does that even mean? Okay, yeah. So the longest path, we know what the longest path is through the through the project, right? And so the other paths would be less than, will be either equal to this specific length or shorter than, right? So that's where we're trying to find just the longest amount of time we can possibly take on the document. That's finding our slack time, right? So in order for us to actually calculate the slack, so while they do kind of describe it in this part of the chapter here, when we come down here is where we actually calculate it. So it's going to be your earliest time or date that it can be experienced to. Let me zoom in here so you guys can see these symbols. Right? So this one that is like a T, so like total, and then E, right? So this is the earliest time that you can complete an event or an activity. And then here is the latest time that you can complete that time or activity. And then our slack time would be calculated as the latest time subtracted by the earliest time. That's how we actually calculate for slack across our project. So we just look for the earliest completion time, the latest one, and then we subtract the two. Take the earliest from the latest, because the earliest is usually the smaller number. Remember, we're not trying to find a negative number here. So for a positive number, you have to have the larger number in front, which is usually the longest or the latest finish time. Right, so TE, earliest finish time, TL, latest finish time. The L and E are little. And so that's what our calculation will look like. So for you to find the earliest time and latest time you can actually do something is where you are going to then, that's where you're now going to go ahead and calculate your slacks. So on the textbook, they have a very basic example here that I want to show you. So I can't zoom in anymore unless I remove this. So I will. And let me close that off. Right, so, oh my goodness. All right. So when we look at this diagram, we do notice our TEs and TL, so we know which one is our latest start time and our earliest start time, right? And we notice also that we have 6 different activities happening. So we move from activity 1, we go to 2. 1 also feeds into 3. And then we've got 4, so 2 feeds straight into 4. And then 2 also feeds into 5. So 2 and 5, well, 2 feeds into 5, and then 3 feeds into 5, and then 5 goes straight to 6, as well as 4 is going into 6. That's what this diagram is telling me. Right? So when I calculate my latest start time and earliest start time along here, what I'm doing is I'm going to be starting from my last date, and I'm going to be working to find my latest finish time.